Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be with you at my first ever virtual conference. As a complete technophobe, it's been an interesting experience, even getting myself to the right spot. So I'm glad I'm in the right spot at the moment. I'm here. Slides, however, felt like a step too far. So it'll just be me talking today. So I'm going to be talking to you today about how we've approached inclusion and diversity at Lloyds Banking Group, and to share some of the things that we've learned with you. We've had a long history of taking action on diversity, dating back around about 30 years now. And I think one of the biggest shifts in our approach has been moving the focus from something nice to do, with a focus largely on employees, to a commercially relevant activity that's holistic in its approach, covering colleagues, customers, and communities. And I guess the starting point is that we take action on inclusion and diversity because we believe it's a strategic business issue for us. And that starts with our purpose, which is to help Britain prosper. As the UK's largest bank, we're located in every community across the UK, and our customers actually are already very diverse. So around half of our retail customers are women, for example, and about 10% of our retail products are held by ethnic minorities. We have an estimated 6 million disabled customers, 500,000 lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender customers. And we know that actively engaging with diverse audiences meets with a really positive reaction. Research, for example, has shown that gay customers are much more loyal to brands that they see as being gay friendly. And we also know that around 80% of disabled consumers have said they switched their bank due to accessibility issues. And of course, these markets are also profitable. For example, the disabled market is worth about £70 billion. And with all of us working and living longer, that market is likely to grow because most of us become disabled during our lifetime rather than being born with a disability. And of course, the so-called pink pound is estimated to be worth around £6 billion. And so in order to be able to serve our customers effectively, we need to be able to understand and meet the needs of all of our customers, and we're helped in that, of course, if our workforce reflects the communities that we serve. And of course, without diversity, there's also the really real danger of groupthink. And groupthink and a lack of diverse perspectives was referenced by the IMF in its report detailing the failures leading up to the economic crisis of 2008. And there's now plenty of research showing that diversity is good for business, not only for risk avoidance, but also for great for improved business performance. And the latest McKinsey report called Diversity Wins, How Inclusion Matters, shows that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity on their executive team were 25% more likely to have above average profitability than companies in the fourth quartile. And if you have more than 30% on your executive team, more than 30% of women on your executive team, you're more likely to outperform companies where the percentage is between 10 and 30%. And that's actually also true with regard to ethnic and cultural diversity. Businesses in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 36% more likely to have higher financial returns than those in the fourth quartile. And so avoiding groupthink and having diverse perspectives is really important for all parts of the business, whether you have a direct interface with customers or not. And of course, there are also huge brand implications if companies get this wrong. You may remember that recently Pepsi had to pull an ad featuring Kendall Jenner handing out Pepsi cans to policemen at a Black Lives Matter protest because it was seen to be trivialising the issues. And some of you may also be old enough to remember the brand Orange, the telephone company, who launched in Northern Ireland with no thought about how an orange brand would play out within the Catholic community. And so it's really important from a reputational perspective to ensure that you've got diverse perspectives. But what I was saying is, just as we need to understand our customers, we also need to understand the changing face of the workforce if we're to build a modern company and attract the best talent. And of course, demographic and social changes were altering the way we live and work even pre-COVID. Our population is ageing and we're living and working longer. We now have 5 generations in the workforce, from millennials through to baby boomers, all with differing needs. And interestingly, 43% of UK employees in the research before COVID valued flexible working above pay. And of course, these changes have massive implications for us if we're to remain an employer of choice, and understanding and responding to these changes will help us to remain competitive. And of course, post-COVID, there's no doubt that we will see increasing changes to the way we live and work, not least a change with regard to flexible working, which I'll touch on shortly. For us, therefore, diversity and inclusion is a business issue, and we've developed a systemic business-like approach in response. I mentioned earlier that LBG had been taking action on diversity for many years, but it was really in 2014 that we shifted our approach from what you might describe as a series of initiatives to a more focused approach. And really, the single most transformative action we took was to become the first FTSE 100 company to set a public goal, as James mentioned in the beginning, to increase the number of our women into senior management positions to 40% from our starting point of 27%. And the reason the goal is so effective is because it provides focus and means you have to treat diversity and inclusion like you would any other business issue if you're going to make progress. And indeed, there is no other business issue where if you had identified a problem, you would allow it to continue indefinitely without sorting it out. And yet that's what we traditionally do with I&D. If there was a problem in our mortgage business, for example, we'd want to see the data, analyse it, work on a plan and set a target to reach. And that's what we've done with inclusion and diversity. And whilst there's no silver bullet in fixing this issue, if there was one, it would be setting a public goal. And personally, I've been working on diversity and inclusion issues for about 30 years. And I can tell you, I really wish I had done this before. It would have saved me a lot of time. I think, therefore, whilst it's always interesting to hear what other companies are doing, the reality is unless you know your own companies where your issues lie, it might not be that helpful. For example, do you have an issue with recruitment, with promotions, with leavers? Because knowing that will allow you to target your activity. Otherwise, you run the danger of putting in place a range of initiatives that don't really sort out the problem. So we spent 6 months cleaning up our data to make sure it was robust. And now I can tell you at any one point how many women, men, Black, Asian, minority ethnic colleagues, disabled colleagues are being recruited, promoted and leaving at each level of the organisation. And the infrastructure around this is important too. We established an operating forum which was chaired by the CEO of our commercial bank and which has managing directors from each of our businesses in attendance. And that's important too, because I&D is not an issue for the I&D team to sort. The inclusion and diversity team is there to provide expert advice and support to help shape the approach, but the implementation really needs to sit with the business. And our operating forum is very much a working group. And so the advantage of that is that you're fixing issues in real time, which allows you to move at pace. In addition, we've added achievement of our inclusion and diversity objectives into our executive scorecards. So that means they are accountable for progress, and accountability drives leadership. Leadership is vital, but leadership on diversity needs to become both a core competence and part of what we expect all our leaders to demonstrate. Otherwise, you run the risk of being dependent on one or two individuals, perhaps a supportive CEO, for example, but when they move on, the focus can often move with them, and so it needs to be integrated into everything that you do. And the final part of the infrastructure is the governance. Our executive committee reviews data on a regular basis, which means that inclusion and diversity becomes a standing item. So there may not always be a lot to say, but it's on the agenda, and again, that provides the focus. And in addition, we have a board level responsible business committee chaired by one of our non-exec directors, which our chairman attends and which provides oversight of our work. Now, setting a goal and data analysis doesn't sound particularly interesting, and ideally we wouldn't have to set a goal, but it's the only thing that I have seen that makes a difference, and without it, we wouldn't have made the progress that we have. And whilst we started with gender, we also became the first FTSE 100 company to set a public goal for Black, Asian and minority ethnic colleagues at senior management in 2018. And just recently, we've become the first company to set a goal to increase the number of Black colleagues, specifically in senior management, following the tragic events in the US recently. And that's probably the other thing that we've learned, which is that you need to be bold and robust. Because when you're trying to change something fundamentally, there will be challenge. When we first introduced our public goal, we did experience some backlash internally, both from women who were worried that they were only getting their jobs because they were women, and from men who felt that their careers would be affected. And I guess my response to that to the women was that opportunities come in all shapes and sizes. And so you need to seize your opportunities when they come. If you're no good, you will be found out. But I'm pretty sure that there aren't too many men in positions of power worrying that they got their jobs because they played golf with someone at some point. But for both groups, it's been important to keep communicating and to talk about why we're taking action, to share the statistics which show that even today, more men get promoted than women, although the gap is closing, and to keep bringing it back to the business case and the benefits. And like any other business metric, targets need to be managed properly and should never be achieved, of course, at any cost. Our experience has shown that you can't lead the debate internally with targets as a focus, because the danger of that is that you create a sense of unfairness and potentially dissatisfaction amongst colleagues, either because an individual may feel, as I say, they only got the job because of their gender or ethnicity, or perhaps even more damaging because their team thinks that's the case. We have found it helpful to show how creating a better environment for one group of people will probably have a beneficial impact on everyone. Diversity for me is like a litmus test, and if you have something that's not working for women, for example, it's probably not working for anyone. Recent research, for example, has suggested that 45% of straight white men have to bend themselves out of shape to fit in at work. Perhaps they're introverted, for example, in an environment where it's important to be an extrovert. So we recognise that building a more diverse workforce simply cannot be achieved without building a more inclusive culture where all colleagues can be themselves, can feel welcomed and achieve their full potential. Inclusion and diversity is relevant to everyone, not just women and minority groups. We're all different in some way, some of it more visible than others. So we want to be an organisation that values and nurtures difference, which means the invisible differences too, so different ways of working, leadership styles, backgrounds, etc. And to do that, I think you also have to challenge the myth of meritocracy. We've all heard that statement, haven't we? That our appointments are all based on merit. And I guess I would question that if who you know matters in an organisation, and if you have to advertise who you are to be noticed. The reality is that some people will have an easier passage, and no matter how brilliant you are, if you don't look like or behave like the people around you, or those in executive positions, you're probably going to have a harder time progressing, and that's what we're seeking to change. But to do that really requires systemic change. And when I look back on some of the early work we did at Lloyds, what I see is a series of interventions that were seeking to really fix women or Black, Asian, LGBT or disabled colleagues. We would run development programs for these groups to enhance their confidence, for example, to help them progress. What we were actually trying to do is to fix those individuals to fit into a system that's actually just not made for them. But women and no other minority group need to be fixed, and neither does anybody else. There is plenty of diverse talent out there, no matter what anybody tells you, but the opportunities are not always there. And so what we really need to do is fix the system. And some of the interventions we have made to try and help with that have included having a diverse candidate on every senior manager shortlist. That includes both internal and external roles, and so applies to our managers and to external headhunters. And if the line managers internally are unable to find a diverse candidate, they have to apply for a waiver, which will only be granted if they're able to demonstrate what they've done to find the diverse talent and what they will do to ensure the situation doesn't arise again. It's also important to be deliberate in your approach. 4 years ago, we set up an objective development process for our senior women. The purpose was not to fix the women, but to identify talent that our existing talent processes had not, and to create a pipeline to Group Executive Committee. All our top 50 women went through it, and there were some really interesting outcomes. Within 18 months, we had increased the number of women on our Executive Committee from 1 to 5. But more importantly, on one level, we placed a couple of women into profit and loss roles who were previously in functional roles. And that was really important because the lack of P&L experience is often called out as one of the reasons that women don't progress. But often the skills required are transferable from functional roles at a senior level. And so we decided to actively place our bets on a couple of women, and they have been very successful. And so again, I think being deliberate and challenging the kind of status quo is really important when you're looking at this issue. Now, of course, it's not anyone's fault that the system doesn't work for everyone. It was created long before any of us even entered the workforce. Most organisations are based on what you might call a 19th century model of work. So in essence, 5 days a week, start work at 16, retire at 60-ish. commute into the centre of town on overcrowded trains, pre-COVID of course. And they're really based on the concept of one person at home doing the caring, normally a woman, and one person at work earning the money, normally a man. In effect, offices are the equivalent of the factories of the Industrial Revolution, and all our systems and processes are really built around this model. And so one of the impacts of this has been on what's traditionally been called flexible working. At a UK level, and this may be true in more organisations, it hasn't quite taken off in the way that we might have imagined when the legislation was first introduced. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because we're trying to tag on individual arrangements to a system that's actually very rigid. There's also the issue, of course, that flexible working has largely been presented as an employee benefit rather than as a business issue, and particularly a benefit for women. So how do you help Mary to have Friday afternoons off to look after Johnny, rather than how do you introduce practices that help the business meet its business objectives and which will also provide Mary with some agility. But even pre-COVID, it was becoming clear that most organisations were not fit for purpose. The digital revolution, increased customer demands, creating a 24/7 culture, the demographic changes I mentioned earlier, mean that organisations really need to change to remain competitive. They need to become more agile to respond to the increasingly complex business environment that we're facing, and that environment has just got a whole lot more complex because of COVID. And so agile working has become one of our big focus areas, and in terms of what we're trying to do from a systemic change. We call it agile working rather than flexible working to distinguish it from the way it's been seen to date as part of the employee value proposition rather than as a contributor to meeting the organisation goals in a challenging environment. And there is a real sweet spot here because employees want agility and employers need it. Now, our approach has been based on the work of the Agile Future Forum, which James referenced at the beginning, where we worked with CEOs and chairmen from a range of sector sizes and locations. And as part of that, we conducted the first ever business case research on the economic benefits of agile working, and we identified substantial value. We found that existing agile working practices were providing benefits of between 3 and 13% of workforce costs. And in some cases, businesses were seeing productivity improvements of up to 10%. But to realise those benefits, a new approach is needed, and it's one that we've adopted at Lloyds Banking Group. And the approach is based around a couple of principles. As a starting point, the business leads on agile working, not HR. Typically, the HR function develops a flexible working policy with a list of acceptable practices, throws it over the wall to the business to implement. But this is actually a business issue, and so the business needs to lead it. In addition, any agile working model needs to be built from the bottom up, because a one-size approach model does not work in an organisation like ours, for example, with so many different business units with different business objectives. And so there are two levels of activity on agile working. One at a business unit or divisional level, where the business really actually thinks like a new entrant to the market. And so we have a framework that takes them through a review of their business objectives, looking at whether their current configuration of working practices is helpful, and shares with them some best practice from around the world to get them to start creatively about how things could be done differently. And once they've identified some new practices, they then involve employees to see whether they would work, to get their input and to devise and create them together. And we've had some really interesting new practices that have come out of these processes. For example, in our telephone banking business, customer demand was really high, was higher at either end of the working day. And so some colleagues wanted to be able to work from home to better manage stress and the commute. And so following the review, the business moved to a range of arrangements, including split shifts, home working for some roles, and a rapid response text alert for off-shift home workers to jump on calls when call volumes spike. And as the results were increased productivity, and also through home workers scheduled on split shifts that were assigned to customer demand, but also increased colleague engagement and increased customer scores as well. Of course, some teams are too small to do a formal review like that. And so for all teams, we have a process called the Agile Team-Led Toolkit. And that provides an objective framework for a line manager to work with their team to review existing arrangements and to see if they're still fit for purpose. And this process can be undertaken at any point, but as a minimum on an annual basis. And one of the strengths of this approach is that it means that the agile working practices are available for all colleagues to reflect the lives they lead. That may be for caring for children or elderly parents, to being a rugby referee or taking part in Ironman competitions. And so it supports both our diversity objectives of removing the barriers to progression that we know do impact on some group of colleagues. And as part of our inclusion agenda, as it's actually genuinely available to all. But of course, the most important bit is it's very much focused in the business, and there is a real strong business case around it. So one of the interesting outputs actually of our work here has been an increased focus on agile hiring. Whilst employees may be able to get agile working within a company, very few external roles are advertised as agile. Research by the organisation TimeWise, for example, suggests that only 15% of roles are advertised as agile, whilst 87% of those looking for a new role would like some kind of agility. And so that means that individuals may get stuck where they are, and for an organisation, it means that you're not necessarily getting the best talent applying for your roles. We also knew that some of our capable women were being put off going for a promotion because they didn't want to give up the working patterns that they had. And so we've changed our system so that hiring managers now have to explain how their roles can be done in an agile way before any role can go live. And since the end of 2016, over 90% of all of our roles are advertised as agile, and 92% of all senior roles are advertised as being open to some kind of agile working arrangement. And so whilst COVID has been really challenging for all of us, I do think we have a real opportunity here to make agile working a reality. But I think now that everybody working remotely, did and provides the chance for workforces a way that benefits both the business and employees. So as I mentioned before, one of the challenges when you start talking about diversity, that those outside of the groups you're focused feel like diversity is not about them, so can become one of the most powerful ways that we've overcome this. Everyone focus on mental health. The business case for taking action on 1 in 4 people will experience poor mental health, not feeling supported, and not even able to discuss their mental health at work. In particular, colleagues experiencing severe anxiety, grief, sleep deprivation, low self-esteem. And so as a result of our findings, we developed a new approach which focuses on the spectrum of mental health, from everyday well-being, clinically diagnosed conditions, and we focus on prevention as well. And our CEO led this campaign and gave a number of media interviews talking openly about his own experiences. And authentic leadership in this space is really key to changing culture and has been a powerful tool in helping remove the stigma. We've also run a lot of training. We've developed a resilience portal. We've trained over 800 mental health advocates and given all colleagues access to free access to Headspace and an increased awareness of our employee assistance program. But we recognise that mental health doesn't just impact our colleagues, it affects our customers too. And so using the insight we've learned from talking to colleagues, we've put in place a number of services to support vulnerable customers facing mental health challenges, offering them different ways to interact with us and to stay in control of their finances. And as a result, from a colleague perspective, we've seen an increase in the number of colleagues happy to tell us that they've had a mental health issue, and their engagement level has increased by 22 percentage points in the past 3 years. So we are making good progress, but we still have some way to go. And of course, changing the culture of a business which employs around 65,000 people in the UK is challenging. At the end of last year, women made up 36% of senior positions from our starting position of 27. And that's been against the backdrop of a contracting organisation. We had around 100,000 colleagues in 2014. We've also surpassed our goal in terms of representation of Black, Asian, ethnic minority colleagues. And whilst we're proud of these results, the other big learning for me is that you have to remain vigilant. This is really hard yards work, and you can never become complacent, and you can make mistakes no matter how much progress you're making. Now, for example, over the last few months, our colleagues and our data have told us that we have a specific issue with Black representation. And despite progress against our collective target, our Black colleagues currently account for only 0.6% of our senior management population. And what was happening was that the progress against our overall goal was masking the fact that most of that progress was being made by our Asian colleagues and not our Black colleagues. And so this year, we launched our new race action plan, which included the setting of this new public goal that I mentioned, to specifically increase Black representation. And the plan is our commitment to understand how our people feel and to address the specific challenges faced by Black colleagues. And we'll be dealing with this in the same way as we have done with any other diversity issues, like any other business issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Are you okay for the next 10 minutes for a few questions?
Sure, of course.
Okay, fantastic. And then, officially we're into the break. So thank you all of you for your patience, and we'll run this until 1 o'clock just to get a few further insights from people. So we've got 37 questions.
Oh my
word. We're not going to get them all done in 10 minutes, but the most popular one is this. I've spoken to women who felt uncomfortable with the target to increase women in exec positions. They felt that others would see this as a tick box exercise and would believe these women came into executive roles due to the goal and not because they have the talent and the experience. What would you say to these women?
Well, I mean, I think it's what I was saying in my presentation. On one level, I think, my advice to women, and as I say, we've had exactly that question in our organisation, and I think there are a couple of things. One for me is this whole thing about seizing the opportunity. Opportunities come along in all sorts of shapes and sizes for individuals, and you have to seize them when they come. And the reality is, once you get into role, if you're not very good, you will be found out. And therefore, I think it's really important. But I think it's important to take the opportunity. But equally, I think from that point of view to women, I would say just be robust about this. But I think there is the more worrying thing, I think, is the idea that others think that you've got your position because you're a woman. But again, I think this all comes about in terms of once you're in the role, if you're good and you do your job well, that really, our whole experience has been that moves away very quickly. It might be there at the beginning, but actually if you're performing well and people see you doing a good job, actually that becomes the overwhelming space for people. So I think the important thing is to take the opportunity. I think so that's for the individual women. Organisationally, I think it's really important to keep coming back to why people have got the job, to explaining the data, to showing the data. And as I was saying earlier, even in our organisation now, the reality is that more men get promoted than women. But actually, if you can keep showing the data, understanding, communicating, the big thing is to keep communicating. Because at the end of the day, this is actually a numbers game, because you have to get diversity into senior positions in order to make sure that if you're serving diverse customers or dealing with anybody from our perspective, you have to have people in positions of authority who reflect those customers, who take part in those conversations. Because otherwise you run into issues like some organisations. For example, there is a hand dryer at the moment that is actually in a lot of offices in Canary Wharf that does not dry the hands of Black people. And the reason for that is because of the way the whole thing has been set up. But the fundamental reason for that is because there were no Black engineers who were involved when that product was being developed. It just didn't occur to that company to think about that. And so the consequence is that dryer does not dry hands of Black individuals. Now, that wasn't malicious, but it was just because the people weren't there, and therefore it's really important that we kind of really focus on this. So to the women, I would say seize the opportunity. To the organisation, I would say be robust, keep communicating in order to create that right environment.
That's wonderful. We've got, let's say, 7 or 8 minutes less. What I loved in what you just said is it sounds like you've got to accept a little bit of noise and grumbling and be strong about that and let the time prove that the right decision was made.
I think that's right. I mean, we've been doing it now for 6 years, which shows, and when any change is going to create noise and heat. You have to stay firm if you believe what you're doing is right, which we do. And therefore, you've got to keep with it and be robust. And the noise will die down. The important thing is not to keep going on about the targets, of course, because it's a bit like, we're all in business to make a profit, but we don't keep talking about that to our customers. We serve our customers in the best way that we can. We don't kind of keep talking to them about profit. And it's the same here. You don't need to lead with the target, but it has to be there, because otherwise, how do you know where you're going, and how do you know when you get there?
Great. I'll try and get 2 more in, so we'll try and do these in 3 or 4 minutes each. So the next upvoted question is, rationally, this all makes sense, the business improvement, etc. But there are also unconscious biases, and of course they can be at quite a senior level as well. How do you overcome these? Practical ideas would be really helpful.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, yes, you're right. Bias is a big issue, and we all have it, whoever we are, and so it's important that. But again, this comes back down to systemic change, I think. So clearly, there's education and training for colleagues, but there is also, that's why we spend such a lot of time on data and monitoring. And things like, I mentioned in my speech that we have a waiver process for so that every single shortlist has to have a diverse candidate on it, and you can't get a shortlist through without a waiver. And so what that means then is that you're actually, this is what I mean about this being hard yards work. You have to be on top of this all the time. And so it means that you do have to look at every week. I sit down with all the vacancies that are in our senior management population, and I go through them to see what the diverse work shortlist looks like, where there are problems, and the business has to explain to me why they haven't managed to get a diverse candidate, for example, on their shortlist. But most importantly, to put in what if they, and there will be times when it is actually just not possible, and they have done everything that they can. But the important thing is to put in place the things that that will make sure that doesn't happen in the future. So I think vigilance, monitoring, really being on top of the data, so that you can explore what's going on, is how that you overcome those unconscious bias. And of course we do things now like we have diverse panels, for example, when you're recruiting. But and that again comes back to the point about why it's important to have representation, because if you have representation and there are diverse people around you, you're unlikely to be making decisions that kind of go into your unconscious bias. But the most important thing is to keep monitoring, to looking at the data, and to be really on top of it all the time.
Okay, Fiona, one last thing, please. Again, let's keep it tight because we are over and people have got to have their lunches. There's a great question here, voted for the 3rd most popular question about, there's research that says that people who've attended private schools tend to get more senior roles, and therefore people from less privileged backgrounds don't. Do you recognise this and work on recruitment and development of people from a less privileged background?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, social mobility is a big issue, and one of the programs that we run is something called Lloyd Scholars, which is actually making sure to kind of work in schools to identify those students who probably wouldn't go to university either because the cost has put them off, or because they don't, no one else in their family has gone to university before. So, and we run a program working with universities to support them through university in order to be able to kind of start to tackle this issue. And so yes, that's that. And one of the things that we're looking at now is where we recruit our graduates from, because most of us recruit from Russell universities. And actually, if you want diverse talent, often you need to be looking beyond the Russell universities too in order to deal with the social mobility thing. So actually, a lot of this stuff, I think, fundamentally is about class more than anything else, and therefore that's a real issue that we are tackling.
Wow, that's fantastic. Look, Fiona, we're going to clap you virtually, so if you can see something, I'm hoping that you're going to see some clapping, because people can do that too. Thank you so much for doing what you've done and for coming along. And we wish you and Lloyds Bank Group all the very best in what you're doing and with your other ventures.
Thank you very much,
Thanks very
James.
much for joining us, and you can make your way out. I'll just make a couple of other comments before we close. Thanks, Fiona, very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.